So we wanted to share how I mark some of the assignments for Assessment Task 1 as a guide to moderate so that we're all on the same page. I know that we weren't grading the learner biography, but the learner biographies are quite crucial to the success or otherwise of these first two assignments for our students this semester. I wanted to share with you to begin with what I consider to be an exemplary assignment from one of my students. And this is the example of the cover page of their learner biography. This student has articulated everything that we have asked them for in terms of identifying when the observation took place, how it took place, and why it took place. So this student to me is demonstrating quite a sophisticated and deep understanding of why we do and why we're asking them to do the things that they were asked to do. I feel that this learner biography is an example of a student teacher understanding and knowing their learner at a quite deep level. The student in question has drawn clearly on their observations during the 3-lesson sequence. It was observed. In analysing her work samples. So this student is drawing on evidence that he's collected to demonstrate his understanding of the particular student. Often when we ask our first years to get to know their students, they might focus very much only on the whole learner and their background. But from this particular example, we can see that this student teacher is understanding that this student works at a slower rate. She works alongside most people, but best when working along this particular peer. Looks for resources to help her with some specific examples, identifies her mental stamina, and her learning level. So on reading this learner biography, I was looking forward to seeing how this student might have used this detailed information in planning his sequence of lessons. I felt that this particular student teacher has made some strong inferences based clearly on the evidence of this learner that he's collected. However, just at the very end, he couldn't resist the temptation to start making some assumptions rather than inferences about this particular student's physical energy, and has drawn a bit of a long bow here to her eating habits outside of school. Not sure that he has evidence in here, the rest of his learner biography, to substantiate this assumption. I've just included this page to demonstrate that all of the elements of a lesson plan were completed, and were completed successfully for all 3 lessons in the sequence. There were clear learning intentions, a vocabulary list, clear links back to the curriculum, and on the next page there was also resources identified very, very clearly. So I just wanted to make sure that all of the elements are still contained in these lesson plans, even though our focus might be more strongly on the annotations. So on the assessment rubric, this would be the section of relevance to mark here. It's a clear and logical structure to the activities, includes link to previous learning, all lesson planning components are included. There are also some really useful strategies to create a positive environment. Speaking of the annotations, I'm hoping that this will be clear enough on the completed video, but I wanted to show the extent to which this particular student has annotated, and not just annotated, but linked his annotations back to the learner biography and to the particular learner involved. So love working with colours based on evidence as seen in their picture books. So using colour as a way to grab their attention and to help them learn. I thought that was an example of quite sophisticated thinking and quite sophisticated use of the learner biography to influence their particular plan. And this is another example of an annotation where the student has referred back to the information that was contained in the learner biography and used that information to adapt his lesson plan, reflected in how he's grouped these particular students. I also thought that this lesson plan was really quite good at identifying opportunities for feedback and questioning all throughout. So it demonstrates that this particular student hasn't left behind the learning from previous semesters and has brought that with them. This is quite a sophisticated and very detailed lesson plan. And whilst we might not do that in practice, what it's demonstrating is that this student is understanding exactly why he's planning the things that he's planning, which was what our aim was. So on the assessment criteria sheet, I would be highlighting this area because there's clear evidence of explicit strategies that have planned to establish, foster a safe, supportive, inclusive learning environment that draw heavily on the learner biographies to inform the approaches that were taken were appropriate for those particular students. In this final section, I asked my students to do a fairly small or brief reflection or post-lesson reflection because we wanted them to spend the bulk of their reflection time focusing on assessment task 2. But I still thought it was worth their while to put in a brief reflection, which this student has done. What I really liked about this student's reflection here was that they found a link to the next lesson. One of the focus of this particular assessment task was on sequencing, on identifying what progress the learners are making that informs how we might need to adapt our subsequent lesson plans. And so here we have found a link to the next lesson. Equivalents started to appear infrequently, so this is what we will work on in the lessons to come. How good was that? This is another example. The odd one out game posed a challenge as students found simplifying fractions difficult. As a result of that, this will be the focus of lesson 3. So this student has clearly understood the importance of sequencing, of building on prior understanding, but not going ahead of where the students are able to achieve. So I thought this was particularly excellent. So overall, in looking at the assessment criteria for this particular student, I ended up giving him an HD in all of the criteria areas and an HD overall. Again, on the criteria feedback sheet, I would be highlighting this particular area on it. I thought there was a logical progression. Each lesson is built on prior learning and allowing the students to explore, to master. There's clear evidence of learning progress being used to inform each subsequent lesson. So I thought he got big ticks on that particular criteria. Similarly, I thought that there was clear evidence of consideration of learner biographies in planning for engagement and inclusion. And I thought that there was quite a lot of thought put into the activities that were planned. So again, I thought the student scored fairly highly on this particular criteria. And briefly, there were no grammar errors in this particular example, and I felt that the professional standard of the lesson plans would enable it to be quite easily passed on to another teacher. The engagement level of the activities was also high, with a strong focus on the students playing games and using quite engaging resources to help them master their fractions. So overall, I was giving this student a high distinction, probably in the mid-80s actually. I was a bit blown away by the quality of this particular assignment. With this second example, this student didn't score quite so well. Once again, I'm showing this page to identify that all of the elements of the lesson plan are present. Not that you can see all of them here, but trust me, they're all there. So here we have learning intentions, we have duration of lesson, year level, etc. We have clear links to the curriculum, vocabulary list as well, And here's the resources. This student's also started to think about assessment strategies, which is excellent to see. So again, all of the elements are here and on subsequent pages as well. I want you to have a little look here at the learning intentions and take note. In the next slide I'll show you the learning intentions for the second lesson plan and then the third. So here are the learning intentions for the second lesson plan, and you'll notice that the first three are the same, and all we've done is add another one. I'm not quite sure what the thinking was here, but I would be hoping that if the students hadn't achieved the first three learning intentions, which seem a little too many to me, that you wouldn't simply be adding another learning intention on top of the first three, that you'd actually focus on the first three so that the students master those before moving on. And once again, same learning intentions with a new one tacked on the end. Not sure about the grasp that the student has on the idea of sequencing, although there is an element of sequencing, and in actual fact the lessons were clearly sequenced when I observed them, but not represented as well as I think they could be on the lesson plans themselves. One of the other things I didn't like quite as much about this student's lesson plans was the emphasis on worksheets. Even though he had tailor-made them, which he seemed to think was a bonus, a lot of his activities in this sequence were based around worksheets that he had identified for the students. Compare that with the engagement levels and the game nature of the previous assignment. So that's something else that I wasn't as convinced about. Having said that, everything in the lesson plans was quite logical and well argued. One of the things that I highlighted in the previous example of an assignment was the reflection area of the lesson plan, and how that previous student had used the progress he'd observed in each lesson to inform and adapt the plans for subsequent lessons. This student hasn't done that. There's no reflection here at all, and even though I know from observing this particular student that he spent an enormous amount of time evaluating how well the students had grasped the concepts that he was teaching to inform what he did in the next class, he hasn't provided any evidence here in his sequence of lesson plans, which is a little unfortunate. So when it comes to scoring this particular lesson plan, or these sections of the lesson plan so far, I was having to score him down here with limited evidence of learning progress being used to form each subsequent lesson, which killed me because I know that he actually did that in practice. I scored him fairly highly for the rest of that particular criteria because the sequence of the lesson was indeed highly logical. I also scored him up here. The structure of his lessons was great, really good questioning and feedback strategies identified elsewhere in the lesson, and some of this sort of positive environment settling in was quite apparent, and clearly reflecting the learning intentions, even though he did include more learning intentions than he actually covered in each lesson. Now to the annotations that this student used. This is quite a comparison with the previous student. He has very clearly identified that he might be trying to be inclusive or to be supportive, but there's no attention to individual students or to the learner biography. There's no identifying how the learner biography or the data that's collected in the learner biography has informed these particular choices that he's making. And yet his learner biographies were every bit as detailed as the examples I showed you from the first assignment. And here are some more examples of his annotations. And his annotations are fine, they're lovely, and clearly identifying what he's trying to achieve. But once again, there's no links at all between his annotations and what's in the lesson plan and the learner biography. It's implicit but not explicit, and that's unfortunate. And again, this particular student is killing me because I know that what he did in practice isn't reflected as strongly as it should have been in the work that he's submitted, which is really, really frustrating. So there appears to be, she says, minimal consideration of learner biographies to inform the approaches that were taken in the lesson plans submitted, even though he did that in practice. Don't you hate that? However, the annotations did show the strategies to use to establish and foster safe, supportive and inclusive learning environment. I didn't feel that the learning experiences were as engaging as they could have been. So they're probably in this area, but maybe in this area a little bit. So they varied from lesson to lesson. And very few, no spelling and grammar errors. It was really easy to read. It could be passed on to another teacher. It was sort of professional. So I was sort of scoring in here somewhere, although not nearly to the same standard as the previous example, so probably down here. So overall, he's a little bit all over the place in terms of his grading, and I probably would score him somewhere down in the high credits, low distinction area. Not that you've seen all of it, but trust me, that's where I would put it. So I hope that this has helped you. You're probably ahead of where I am in terms of your marking, but that's how it goes. So hopefully that's of some assistance.